Sorry, it's a little dark. I wanted to scramble back up the ladder like smoke going up a chimney, but I didn't. Buck was down here. It was the only place he could have gone. He might be injured or need help. On the wall across from me were two tunnel openings. I turned the flashlight off for a moment to see if any light came from them. Both openings disappeared in the darkness. I remember reading that when people saw a Sasquatch in their headlights, the animal's eyes reflected light, a sign of nocturnal behavior. The Sasquatch would have to see in the dark like humans see in the daylight to live in a place like this. I turned the flashlight back on. If I called out, Buck would probably be able to hear me, but so would the Sasquatch. Gathering my courage to catch a glimpse of one of them on the trail in daylight was hard enough. I wasn't about to call one to me down here. My only choice was to pick one of the openings and see if it led me to Buck. I chose the left opening, which led to a long tunnel about 6 feet wide and 10 feet tall. I followed it for 200 or 300 feet and stopped. In front of me were 4 more tunnels. I turned the flashlight off and again found myself in total darkness. One of the tunnels had to lead outside, or how would the Sasquatch get in? But which one? If I always took the far left tunnels, I would be able to find my way back to the ladder by taking right tunnels, right? Just in case I was wrong, I found a rock and scraped it along the wall as I walked. I lost track of how many tunnels I passed through. Some of them were hundreds of feet long, some only a few steps. After a while, all the tunnels started looking the same, and I began to wonder if I was going in a circle. Eventually, I stumbled into a huge cavern, and at first I thought I was back where I started. I was relieved. I had about enough of spelunking. All I wanted was to go up the ladder and eat about 6 cans of chili, but there was no ladder, and there were no more tunnels. Dead end. Like the first cavern, the ground was littered with branches and old bones. I was about ready to start retracing my steps when I heard a now very familiar rumbling, followed a few seconds later by a violent shaking that hurled me to the ground. It was one thing to experience an earthquake above ground, but it's something entirely different to go through one with thousands of tons of rock above your head. It scared me so bad I started to scream, but I couldn't hear myself above the noise of the rattling cave. Rocks pelted me from above like small meteorites. I covered my head and screamed some more and thought my heart was going to burst from my chest. When the quake finally ended, I lay on my back gasping for breath, shocked that I was still alive and convinced that if it happened again, I wouldn't be. I found the flashlight and started jogging back through the tunnels, but somewhere along the way I screwed up. I reached the end of a tunnel and found a single opening that was too small for me to crawl through. I started backtracking desperately looking for my little scrape marks, but all the tunnels I passed through were unmarred. Panic set in and I began to shout for Buck as I wandered through the tunnels. I no longer cared if the Sasquatch heard me. Maybe one of them could show me how to get out of here. My voice echoed back to me from all directions. I don't know how long I wandered around yelling like this, but pretty soon my voice was gone and the shouts were more like whispers. I stumbled into another large cavern and discovered a very important clue about Buckley Johnson's past. What are 2 of the most worthless items you can find when you're lost in a cave? A parachute and $200,000 in $20 bills. There they were, right in my flashlight beam, like a heap of garbage. I collapsed on the pile of bills and closed my eyes. I told you it was Pandora's box. I sat up. Buck was standing above me carrying a lantern. I had never been more happy to see anyone in my whole life. I wouldn't have cared if he had hijacked Air Force One. I threw my arms around him and started crying. It's all over now, Dylan. I know the way out of here. You can relax now. It's all over. Chapter 14. But it was far from over for either of one of us. I picked up a bundle of bills. Does this belong to you? I asked. Not exactly, Buck said. I told Buck about my conversation with Agent Crow. When I finished, Buck took a deep breath and let it out slowly. There's a lot more to it than Crow knows. Gary was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. He was just wasting away. I read about this new experimental treatment for cancer in Mexico. I wanted to take him down there and see if they could do something for him. But I didn't have the money, and of course my insurance wouldn't pay for it. I couldn't just sit by without doing everything possible for my boy, so I hijacked the airplane. It might have worked too if I hadn't broken my hip when I landed. And that's when Billy Taylor found you? Buck shook his head. I mean, Billy nursed me back to health. That's part true. But it was a Sasquatch that found me that night. She picked me up and carried me to Billy's. She? Yep, a big, beautiful female Sasquatch. And she carried you to Billy's cabin. Buck chuckled a little bit, like a baby. She must have spotted my chute coming down because when I landed, she was there within minutes. Seeing her scared me worse than jumping out of the jet. When she picked me up, I passed out. I woke up in Billy's cabin and thought I had dreamed the whole thing. It wasn't until I saw Billy standing in front of the cabin with the Sasquatch that I knew I had been rescued by a cryptid. How long did you stay in the cabin? Weeks. The police and the National Guard were scouring the woods for D.B. Cooper, and I couldn't leave. Billy called Betty and told her he had me in the cabin. She asked him to hide me until it was clear. Billy had the perfect hiding spot. The cavern below Pandora's box. Yep, I stayed down there in that miserable hole for 2 weeks. Then he brought me up to the cabin. And Gary? He died while I was at Billy's. The treatment in Mexico probably wouldn't have worked anyway. The only real regret I have about the whole thing was that I wasn't there for Betty when she needed me, and I didn't get to say goodbye to Gary. A tear glistened on Buck's cheek in the dim lantern light. It was several minutes before he could continue. He took a handkerchief out and wiped his face. Anyway, when I got back home, I wanted to turn myself in, but Betty wouldn't hear of it. She said that she had lost her son, and she wasn't about to lose her husband too. She's the one that concocted the Mexican hit-and-run story. I didn't think the story would fly for a second. I went along with it to humor her, though. When they hauled me in for that lineup, I figured that was it. Someone was bound to pick me out, but they didn't. And the money has just sat here this whole time, right where Billy stashed it. Agent Crow said that they found some of the money in 1980. A few packets fell out of the bag when I was hanging onto the back of the 727. They must have landed in a stream and made their way to the Columbia. When did Agent Crow come back into the picture? A few years ago, Buck smiled. When he first came back, I was scared to death, but I've gotten used to having him around now. You're kidding. Seriously, it keeps us both on our toes. How did he look? Terrible. He needs to eat better food and exercise, which reminds me, are you hungry? I'm starving. Buck reached into his pocket and brought out a carrot. It wasn't exactly what I had in mind, but it tasted pretty good. What is this place? Lava tubes. They're formed in lava on the surface, cools and hardens, but the molten lava below continues to flow. If it weren't for these tubes, the Sasquatch would have been discovered a long time ago. They spend their days underground and leave the tubes at night to hunt. Why did you come down here? I talked to your dad. Not in person, on the radio, but the others. Before he left, we set up a code. If he needs to talk to me, he'll say something like, I just flushed 12 grouse, which means I'm supposed to switch the radio to channel 12, and we can talk without the others hearing us. How was he? What's going on? Well, he's tired and worried, which is why he called in. He thinks Kurt Skip is onto something. Early this morning, Kurt took off on his own, and your dad hasn't seen him for hours. Where did he go? Well, that's the problem. Your dad doesn't know. He says that Kurt is like some kind of wolf. He goes all day, doesn't say a word, doesn't get tired, sleeps for about 4 hours, and takes off again. I came down here to make sure everything was okay. There's a surface entrance in that ravine the triplets are poking around in. If they find it, the Sasquatch will no longer be a myth. Did you tell Dad I was here? No, I think he has enough on his mind right now. I was relieved he didn't tell him. What's Dad going to do? He'll know more this evening after they have their powwow. He didn't want to stay on the radio very long. That's all I know. I'm glad you found me. I was scared to death. I'm awful sorry about that, Dylan. I didn't think it would take me so long to get down to the ravine and back. In the old days, I used to be able to do it pretty quick. Guess I'm getting too old for this. I also didn't think that you'd figure out what the staff is used for. When we heard you yelling after that quake, we started looking for you. What do you mean, we? He smiled, pointed out into the dark cavern. I guess I should have introduced you. My breath caught in my throat. Standing off in the shadows near the tunnel opening was a massive figure. I couldn't see it very clearly, but it had to be at least 7 feet tall. Don't make any sudden moves, Buck said. They're real skittish, especially around strangers. What's he doing out there? Probably wondering what you're doing in here. He's harmless. When you started yelling, he led me right to you. The Sasquatch moved further back into the shadows as if he knew we were talking about him. I would have never found you on my own, Buck continued in a quiet voice. The echoes down here are really confusing, and you kept moving, but it didn't take long for the Sasquatch to hone in on the real thing. They're amazing creatures, powerful, intelligent, and incredibly perceptive. I don't believe in that mental telepathy hocus pocus, but if any creature has the ability, it's the Sasquatch. They always seem to show up at the right time. I couldn't believe that I was actually looking at a Sasquatch. It was no more than 20 feet away. I wanted to walk over and touch it, make sure it was real. Can you talk with them? I whispered. Not talk. They don't have what I would call a vocabulary, but we can communicate after a fashion. Billy was much better than I am. He used hand signals. I wished I could have spent more time with him here, and with him up here, and learning how he did it. But he died before I got the chance. The Sasquatch started moving toward the tunnel. Where's it going? Hard to say. Just as the Sasquatch moved through the opening, it turned its head and looked back at us. I saw its face clearly. Its large eyes were dark and almond-shaped. The hair on its head was much longer than the hair on its body. Thanks, I said, and it quickly disappeared down the tunnel. I can't believe this. Fortunately for the Sasquatch, very few people believe in them. It's the only thing that has kept them alive all these years. I stared at the passageway, hoping that the Sasquatch would reappear. Buck went on to explain that he had checked out the surface entrance in the ravine. I think those earthquakes have opened it up a little more. I suspect the Sasquatch were down there trying to disguise the entrance. They're pretty good at this. Clyde must have heard them working. You would almost have to fall in the entrance to find it, but I'm worried that Clyde or one of his brothers might stumble across it. Or worse, convince Flag to send everyone down there to look. If Kurt Skip is as good as they say he is, he might be able to find it. So what can we do about it? Well, I've been thinking about that. Come on, I'll show you something. I followed Buck down several tunnels. We came into another cavern. Next to one wall was a pile of huge footprint castings. I picked one of them up. The sole was made out of rubber. Across the top was a strap to attach to your shoe. Where did these come from? I made them a few years back. I took castings of real Sasquatch prints, then made molds out of the castings. They leave a pretty convincing Sasquatch print. I'd be surprised if Kurt Skip could tell the difference between this and the real thing. They were heavy. I still don't understand what you use them for. Why would you want to leave fake footprints? Billy used them to get people away from the surface entrances. When searchers got too close, he would go 10 or 20 miles away, then call on the footprints discovery anonymously, and the Sasquatch searchers would come running. Dr. Flagg and his gang would follow Sasquatch footprints across molten lava. I was hoping you would put a pair of these on and lead the expedition away from the ravine. Me? Buck slapped his bad hip. I'm afraid my footprints come out a little uneven these days. The first thing we did when we got back into the cabin was eat. After this, we went outside and Buck gave me Sasquatch walking lessons. Big strides, he encouraged me. Giant steps. And don't be afraid of really slamming those footprints down into the ground. Excuse me. Hopping around with the heavy footprint strapped to my feet was exhausting, and it was going to be a lot harder doing it in the woods when it was dark. We won't know where to lay the prints until your dad contacts us, Buck explained. He said he would try to slip away and give me a call sometime tonight after they get together. My lesson was interrupted by the two-way radio. I scared up 4 deer on the way over here, Dad said. It was great to hear his voice. Buck switched the frequency to channel 4. We waited for 10 minutes and nothing happened. Why doesn't he call us, I asked. I don't know. He might have just been telling us the channel for later. Several more minutes passed. Then we heard Joe's voice. I don't care, Flag. We don't care. We're leaving now. I wish you would reconsider, Joe, Flag said. I thought they were at the ravine together, I said. Why are they using the radio and a different channel? Your dad is holding the send key down on his radio so we can hear the conversation. Shh. You're going to lose your investment, Joe, Flag said smoothly. You all signed a contract. If you back out now, you won't get a share. Doesn't do a lot of good if we're dead, Henry said. That last quake did it for me. I want to find a Sasquatch, but not if I have to die to do it. Where's Kurt Skip? Clyde asked. He's on to something, Flag said. He wanted to check it out before he came in. Nice try, Flag, Henry said. I'm serious. Did he see footprints? Clyde asked. No, Dad said. He just said he would catch up with us later. I could just see Dr. Flag glaring angrily at Dad. Buck laughed. Doesn't matter if he's onto something or not, Joe said. It'll be dark in half an hour, and I'm not spending another night on this mountain. We're going back to the truck. We are out of here. 3 down, Buck said. 5 to go. Maybe they'll move away from the ravine, and you won't have to lay those prints. We'll have to split up tomorrow, Flag said, in order to cover the search area. We're not done with the ravine, Clyde said stubbornly. There was a long pause, then Flag said, I'll tell you what I'll do. We'll all go down there first thing tomorrow morning. If we don't find anything by noon, we'll continue our sweep through this area. Would that be all right, Clyde? Yeah, I guess so. Buck groaned. Looks like we're going back down into Pandora's box. He switched the radio to the teen's frequency in case Kurt Skip checked in. Chapter 15. We're going to lead them right out of there, Buck said. I'll take you to the surface entrance. It's right next to the stream that runs along the bottom of the ravine. When you get there, follow the stream for about 2 miles, then strap on those big feet. I want you to jump in and out of the stream like you're trying to catch a fish. The Sasquatch do this all the time. Follow that stream right up the hillside and out of the ravine. There's a logging road up on top. Just keep following it until you see me. I'll meet you there in the Jeep. While you're making your way there, I'll stomp around with another set of footprints in a new area. They'll think there are two Sasquatch, and I guarantee they'll forget about the ravine for the time being. How do you know they'll see the footprints in the ravine? SWAG. Scientific wild-ass guess, I added. The easiest way down to the ravine is to cross the stream. Don't worry, they'll see them. If they... Johnson! The two-way radio barked from the kitchen table. Are you out there, Johnson? Buck snatched the radio off the seat. It sounds like Agent Crow, I said. It is. What's he doing? He'll ruin everything. Batteries are going dead on this thing. The transmission started to break up. I've run off the road near Longmire Spur. Guess I was knocked out for it. I think my legs broke. I hope. Are you still out there, Joe? Flag asked. Did you catch any of that? Some of it, Joe said. Who was it? I don't know. I don't care. We're at the truck now and we're leaving. Was he talking about Buckley Johnson? Flag asked. You think he's out there somewhere? No one answered. Joe? What time did Agent Crow head back to his car? Buck asked. I saw him about 10 o'clock. Buck looked at his watch. The only reason that fool's up here is because of me. I have to help him. What about the footprints? I'll lead you to the surface entrance, then come back to get the Jeep and see what I can do for Crow. You take the radio. What about you? I'll use Crow's radio when I get to him. We'll use Channel 4. That way we'll be able to hear your dad if he has any more news for us. We climbed down into the cavern. Buck led me effortlessly through a bewildering series of tunnels. I wouldn't be able to find my way out of there on my own in a million years. We didn't see any Sasquatch, and I was kind of disappointed. Here we are, Buck said, leading the way down yet another tunnel. It led to what looked like an underground lake. Water dripped down from the ceiling of the cavern like rain. What is this? Lava Lake. At least that's what I call it. The surface entrance is on the other side. Do I swim? No. I have a boat. I followed him to the edge of the water. A small dinghy was tied up there. Just paddle straight across. You'll see what looks like a set of stairs. They lead up to the entrance. I'd take you across, but I should probably get back to the Jeep. Crow didn't sound. I can do this. Go ahead. I'll be fine. Okay, remember, follow the stream for a couple of miles before you put on the big feet. I'll see you on that logging road somewhere. And keep your eyes open for Kurt Skip. With any luck, he's back at camp, but you never know. Buck hobbled back into the tunnel, and I got on the dinghy and started across the lake. I had no problem finding the stairs on the other side. They went up for about 20 feet. On the top was a tunnel, and as soon as I stepped into it, I knew it led outside. I could smell the beautiful fresh air. The outside entrance was right behind a waterfall. No one would be able to find it unless they saw a Sasquatch go into it. I started following the stream, detouring around several beaver ponds. It was rough going in the dark. I used my flashlight sparingly, afraid someone might see it from the top of the ravine. Buck hadn't mentioned how I would know when I had traveled 2 miles. All I could do was guess. I strapped on the prints and started playing Bigfoot. After a while, I could barely lift my feet. I had to stop and rest. I shined the flashlight on my back trail, and I was pleased with what I saw. Sasquatch footprints leave quite an impression in soft sand, and an even bigger impression in the minds of those who see them. I started again, but I didn't get very far. Buck! It was Dad. I don't know if you can hear me or not, but something is definitely going on. Kurt Skip didn't return to camp, so he must be onto something. I think he might be down in the ravine. I'm on my way down there to see if I can do anything. Clyde says he couldn't pick up radio signals down there, so I guess I'll have to check in with you after I get back to the top. I stared at the radio. I didn't know if I should tell him I was down there or not. Go ahead and answer him, Dylan. I nearly jumped out of my footprints. A bright light shined in my face. My, what big feet you have, Kurt Skip said. His flashlight was taped to the top of his rifle. He pointed it along my trail, then back at me. You've been busy. I was too stunned to speak. Where's Buck? He asked. I don't know who you're talking about. Really? Well, I heard this very interesting conversation over the radio this afternoon. It was between Buck and your father. Buck seemed very concerned about this ravine. He told your father that it was imperative that they get us away from this area. I guess Kurt had broken Dad's radio code. I pressed the send button on the radio, hoping Dad would hear us. So I came down here for a look, Kurt continued. I didn't see anything, and I was about ready to head back to camp and discuss this with Dr. Flagg when I heard you crashing around down here. So what are you going to do now? I think we should head upstream together. I'd like to see where you came from. Maybe Buck is there. Maybe something else. You can take those footprints off. I don't think you'll need them anymore. I sat down and undid the straps. I slipped the radio into my coat pocket and continued to press the send button. You lead, Kurt said. We started walking along the stream. My only hope was to lead him past the waterfall and out of the other end of the ravine. This whole Bigfoot thing was all a hoax, I said. Dad and Buck and me were all in on it. Dad's writing a book on hoaxes, and this was part of his research. Nice try, Dylan. Kurt didn't seem convinced. Did you know my dad told Clyde where to take that photo of Sasquatch? So? So it wasn't a Sasquatch. It was Dad in a gorilla suit, but Clyde didn't know it. A gust of wind blew an unpleasant smell our way. Hold it, Kurt said. What is that? It smells like a dead animal. Not now, I thought. We were standing next to a beaver pond. I turned around, and Kurt was sniffing the air. Suddenly he stopped sniffing and became very still. He was looking at something just over my shoulder. You're a liar, Dylan, he said quietly. I turned to look. The Sasquatch was standing near a big fir tree not 50 feet away. When I turned back, Kurt had raised his rifle. I charged into him. The rifle went off as we fell to the ground. Kurt hit me in the face, then slammed me in the stomach with his knee. I couldn't breathe. He found his rifle and stood up. Dylan, I'll come back and deal with you in a minute. But first, I have some business to take care of with your friend. He started to walk away, and I twisted around trying to see if the Sasquatch had gone. A bright light flashed in the sky. Kurt stopped in mid-step and looked up. There was a loud hiss, a blast of air, then the forest started to come apart. Chapter 16. The impact of the explosion threw me into the pond. I dove underwater and held my breath for as long as I could. When I popped to the surface for air, I got a mouthful of hot ash. I gagged and went back under. I struggled out of my coat, put it above my head, and surfaced again. The coat protected my head from the hot ash, but I was able to breathe after a fashion. The coat protected my head from the hot ash, and I was able to breathe after a fashion. Trees crashed all around me. The ground shook, and thunder cracked. I don't know how long I stayed in the icy water. Eventually the noise diminished, then stopped altogether. The only thing I heard were my teeth chattering. I was freezing. I lifted the coat from my head. It was dark out, and there was still a lot of ash in the air, but it looked as if the worst had passed. I stumbled out of the stream. I had to get out of these wet clothes and get dry. Dylan! Dylan, are you there? It was Dad. I don't know if you can hear me. The radio? I found it near Kurt's skip, or what was left of him. He had been crushed by a tree. Dad, I'm here. Are you okay? No, I'm in bad shape. It's good to hear you, son. I tried to get you, but the mountain... Where are you? I want you to get out of here, Dylan, he said weakly. You need to find a road that can be seen from the air. As soon as it gets light, they'll send in rescue crews. They'll pick you up. But you have to get... Where are you, Dad? Is Kurt Skip with you? He's dead. Where are you? You'll need to get out on your own, then. He started coughing. I'm near a waterfall. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. Just get to the road. Dad. I felt around until I found Kurt's rifle. The flashlight taped to it was still working. I took it off and started toward the waterfall. I climbed over and under scores of fallen trees. My eyes were swollen and the air was choked with ash, which made it really difficult to breathe. When I got to the falls, I called out for Dad, but he didn't answer. It took me half an hour to find him. He was slumped next to a tree trunk, unconscious. His breathing was shallow and labored, and when I shook him, he didn't respond. He had hot ash burns all over his face and hands, and there was a deep gash on his forehead oozing blood. I found a first aid kit in his pack and wrapped his wound. I needed to find help for him, but first I had to get him out of the ash-filled air so he could breathe easy. I started dragging him into the waterfall. He came to for a moment when the water from the falls hit his face. Forget about me, Dylan. You need to get out of here. We both need to get out of here, I said, but he didn't hear me because he had passed out again. I pulled him through the passageway behind the falls and laid him near the edge of Lava Lake. The air inside the cave was clear of ash, and Dad's breathing seemed to improve. Now what? I would never be able to find my way to the cabin through the maze of tunnels, the left going back out to the ravine and hiking to the logging road that Buck had told me about. I wasn't strong enough to drag Dad all the way, which meant I would have to bring help to him. So after all our efforts to conceal the Sasquatch, I was now going to lead people through the cryptid's front door. It wasn't fair, but there didn't seem to be any other choice. Maybe Dr. Flagg was right after all. There just wasn't any more room for the Sasquatch to remain a myth. Dad's sleeping bag was in his pack. I laid it out and got him into it. There was also a plastic tarp in the pack, and I found some sticks and set up a shelter to keep the dripping water from the ceiling off of him. I stripped out of my wet clothes, and put on some of Dad's dry clothes, which was a huge relief. Then I gathered a pile of sticks and started a small fire to keep Dad warm while I was gone. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a splashing noise from the other side of the lake. At first, I thought it must be Buck, that he had found Agent Crow. taken him to the cabin, and then come down here to take a look for me. I shined the flashlight across the lake. It wasn't Buck. It was a Sasquatch. And he was wading toward us. He stopped and shielded his eyes from the light. I lowered the beam to the surface of the water, and the Sasquatch continued across the lake. I didn't know if this was the same one that had been with Buck, but it was just as big. The water in the middle of the lake came to his waist. I told myself that there was nothing to be afraid of, that the Sasquatch was harmless, but my heart was beating like a hummingbird's wings. I wanted to run away, but I couldn't leave Dad. The Sasquatch came out of the lake and shook the water off his fur like a dog. A terrible stench filled the air. The Sasquatch stood on the shore and looked at us for a few moments, then walked over to the fire and squatted down near Dad. He bent over and looked at Dad's face, then gently touched the bandage on his forehead. I wondered if this was the same Sasquatch that had built the shelter for Dad. Maybe he recognized him. "He's hurt," I said. The Sasquatch turned his head and looked at me. He may not have understood what I said, but I was certain that he understood that Dad was in trouble. He stood up and walked toward the stairs leading to the surface entrance. "Where are you going?" He paused and glanced back at me, then continued into the passageway. I followed him. When I got outside, he was standing near the waterfall, peering into the darkness. The air was still dense with ash. I shined my flashlight over the jumble of fallen trees. If I was going to get help for Dad in time, I had to get moving. With all the fallen trees, the climb out of the ravine was going to be difficult. The Sasquatch stepped back behind the waterfall. I followed him. I wasn't worried about leaving Dad with the Sasquatch, but I was very worried about the Sasquatch being in the cavern when I returned with help. Leading people to the cavern was bad enough. I didn't want to introduce them to the Sasquatch. Back inside, the Sasquatch squatted down again and took a close look at Dad's face, then slipped his arms underneath the sleeping bag and stood up with him. "What are you doing?" "This is the best place for him right now," I pointed to the ground. "There's no ash in here." I waved my hands in the air. "He can breathe in here." I took an exaggerated breath and let it out. The Sasquatch paid no attention and started walking across the lake, and with Dad cradled in his arms. All I could do was follow. I got into the dinghy and paddled across. When we reached the other side, the Sasquatch carried Dad down the tunnel. After a while, I started to recognize some of the tunnels and realized where the Sasquatch was going. He was taking Dad to the cabin. When we got to the ladder, I shouted for Buck, hoping that he and Agent Crow had somehow gotten back to the cabin, but there was no answer. The Sasquatch laid Dad down and made a motion for me to go up the ladder. "You want me to go first?" I started up, hoping he understood that I wanted him to bring Dad up behind me. With Dad in the cabin, I could close Pandora's box before I got help. I told the rescuers that we were staying in the cabin when the volcano erupted. The secret of the lava tubes would be safe. Other than a couple chairs being turned over, the broken dishes on the floor, the cabin was in pretty good shape. I lit a lantern and set it near Pandora's box. Dad's head and shoulders came up through the opening. He was still unconscious. I grabbed him under the arms and pulled him the rest of the way into the box. I checked to see if he were still breathing, and was relieved to see that he was. The Sasquatch had a difficult time getting his wide muscular shoulders through the opening, but he managed to wiggle through. He climbed out of the box and reached over and picked Dad up. "You can lay him here," I pointed to one of the cots. The Sasquatch started towards the front door. "No," I said, "he'll be comfortable right here." The Sasquatch opened the front door and walked outside. I followed him. "Where are you going?" He looked back at me, then continued walking. I wasn't about to try to wrestle Dad away from him. I ran back inside, closed the trap door, turned the locks with the staff, then slammed the lid to Pandora's box. Before I left the cabin, I screwed the carving of Mount St. Helens back onto the top of the staff and hid it under the sleeping bag on Buck's cot. I didn't know where the Sasquatch was taking Dad, but he seemed to know where he was going. I followed him down the steep road that led to the cabin. The eruption hadn't done much damage to this part of the mountain, and there was less ash in the air. We only had to climb over a few trees on our way down the hill. When we got to the main road, I remembered I still had Kurt's radio. I tried to reach Buck, but there was no response. I switched channels and tried the team frequency, experiencing the same results, but Dr. Flagg answered immediately. "Who is this?" "Dylan Hancock, are you okay?" "Broken arm, but I'll live." "What are you doing up here?" "I came up to find Dad." "He's not here. I'm alone." "Where's Clyde and his brothers?" "We heard a shot last night, and they ran down into this ravine we were searching. That's the last time I saw them. I don't know where your dad and Kurt are either." I didn't tell him that Dad was with me. He would probably want to talk to him, and it would be hard to explain why he couldn't. "I'm on my way down the mountain," I said. "Where are you?" "I'm above that ravine. It's between roads 626 and 628. I'll send someone. Just wait there." "Dylan?" I wasn't in the mood to talk to Dr. Flagg. I turned the radio off. The sun rose, casting a strange reddish light through the ashy air. Large sections of forest had been flattened by the blast. The downed trees looked like great toothpicks spilled on the hillsides. We walked for miles. Actually, I jogged most of the time. The Sasquatch was hard to keep up with. When I got too far behind, he would stop and wait for me. There was no change in Dad's condition, but at least he was alive. We reached a paved road, and I began to wonder if the Sasquatch was going to carry Dad right into the nearest town. He didn't have to. About a mile down the road, the Sasquatch came to a sudden stop. He looked up at the sky as if we were listening to something. I couldn't hear anything. He set Dad on the ground, then I heard it, and a few seconds later saw it. A helicopter, flying low to the ground, appeared from behind the hill in front of us. I jumped up and down and started yelling. It hovered for a second, sending up clouds of swirling ash, then landed in the middle of the road. 2 men jumped out of the chopper and ran over to us. "I'll get the stretcher," one of them said, and ran back for it. The second man looked around curiously. "I thought there were 3 of you." I looked around too. The Sasquatch had vanished. "No," I said, "just my dad and me." After. Dad regained consciousness later that day. I was sitting next to his hospital bed. His first few words were, "Did they find it?" "No, the Sasquatch are safe for now." He smiled and closed his eyes. The doctor said he was going to be fine, but he would have to stay in the hospital for a while. Some of the burns he had were pretty bad, and the hot ash had damaged his lungs. Joe West, Henry, and Dean made it off the mountain without a scratch. I saw them being interviewed on the television from the hospital room. They said they had been fishing when the mountain erupted. Dr. Theodore Flagg was also interviewed. He said he was on the mountain looking for Sasquatch and was going to write a book about his experience during the eruption. He was treated at the same hospital as Dad, but he never came by to see how Dad was doing. Clyde and his brothers were never seen again. Maybe he found that gate to Zona after all. They found what was left of Buck's Jeep on a logging road, but Buck wasn't in it. There was no sign of Agent Crow's Taurus. The area he had gone off the road was one of the worst areas hit on the whole mountain. I went to the hospital every day to visit Dad, then went to Buck's and knocked on his door, hoping he would answer it. He wasn't home, and I knew he wasn't coming home. I was really going to miss him. It took me a week to get a hold of Mom in Egypt. I told her Dad was in the hospital. I didn't tell her why he had been on the mountain. I thought I should leave that to Dad. The eruption on Mount St. Helens was going to seem like a belch when she found out what we were really doing up there. The night before her return, I found this email message on my computer. "An old friend is coming by for a visit tonight at 8 p.m. Buck." I read this message a dozen times, but still couldn't believe it had come from Buck. At 8 o'clock, a car pulled into the driveway. I opened the front door, expecting to see Buck, but it wasn't. Agent Crow got out of the back seat of a taxicab. He was on crutches, and I went out to meet him. I thought he held up his hand and spoke to the driver. "Wait here. It won't be long. Let's go inside, Dylan." When we got inside, he sat down on the sofa. "I thought you were dead," I said. "I thought Buck and you—" "I thought so too," he said. "He found me just before the mountain erupted. When it blew, he jumped onto the front seat, and we were buried under tons of trees. The doors wouldn't open. I know that. I kept drifting in and out of consciousness. Every time I came to, he told me we were going to be just fine, but I knew he was lying. We were dead men. I don't know how long we sat there like that. I have a vague memory of hearing logs being moved and metal grinding as the door was being pried open. The next thing I know, I'm lying on the road, and Buck standing above me waving at the sky. I have no idea how he got us out of that car. I had a very good idea. He had a little help from his friends. They flew us out and took us to the hospital. Buck was released the next day. How long were you down there before Buck found you?" "Most of the day. I went off the road right after I saw you. According to the doctors, I had had a heart attack. Can you believe that?" Easily, I thought. "So where's Buck?" "I have no idea. I just got out of the hospital half an hour ago. The nurse said that a man asked her to give me these." He reached into his pocket and came out with a set of keys that looked familiar. "She said the man told her I should take these over to Dylan and see if he had a freezer." I led Agent Crow into the garage. He looked at the freezer for a moment, then slipped on a pair of rubber gloves. "You better step back, Dylan." I don't know if he expected a bomb or a Sasquatch to jump out. He put the key in, turned the lock, then opened the lid very slowly. "Well, I'll be. Give me a hand." Inside was a parachute, a big plastic bag filled with bundles of $20 bills. I helped him pull the bag and parachute out. Underneath them, we found Buck's walking staff and 2 envelopes with our names on them. Agent Crow opened his first. Inside was a single sheet of paper that read, "I, Buckley Johnson, confess to the hijacking of Northwest Airlines Flight 305 on the night of November 25th, 1971. Sincerely, Buckley Johnson, a.k.a. D.B. Cooper." The note addressed to me said, "Dylan, this is the deed to my cabin. I signed it over to you and your dad. It's just too much work for an old man like me. The staff is for you, something to remember me by. Lava Lake has been closed down. I thought it was best under the circumstances. Please tell Agent Crow that he needs to start eating better and exercising. It would be a shame if he keeled over before he caught me. All my love, Buck. Are you going to go after him? I asked. Of course, he said. Like Buck says, I need the exercise. What about the money? I'm going to take it down to the FBI headquarters right now. Give me a hand. I helped him haul the bag and parachute out to the cab. Agent Crow got into the back seat and rolled the window down. So, Dylan, he said, did you ever see that Sasquatch? In my dreams, Agent Crow. In my dreams. After he drove away, I went back inside. I picked up the staff and saw that Buck had carved a new face onto it. I held it under the light. It looked a lot like me. The end.